Lecture 65, Walt Whitman.
I celebrate myself, and what I assume, you shall assume. For every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. I loaf and invite my soul. I lean and loaf at my ease, observing a spear of summer grass. So begins the long poem called Song of Myself in Leaves of Grass, the first volume of poetry published by Walt Whitman. In July of 1855, when the volume first appeared, the 36-year-old Whitman was already known as a journalist in both New York and Brooklyn, and had begun to make his name as a poet. Besides publishing a novel and over 15 stories in New York newspapers by the time he was 24, he had also published a number of individual poems. But Whitman was nothing if not versatile. He prided himself on working with his hands as well as his mind and soul, and he thought of himself not only as a writer, but a mechanic in the old-fashioned sense of the word, a skilled laborer. Born in West Hills, Long Island in May 1819, just 2 months before Herman Melville first saw the light of day in New York City, Whitman was the second son of a house builder who moved his family to Brooklyn when Walter was 4 years old. After 7 years of formal schooling, he worked first as an office boy, learned the printing trade in Brooklyn, and worked as a printer in New York. He then taught school on Long Island, founded a newspaper in the town of Huntington, Long Island, started publishing his poetry, worked for various newspapers in New York, did some politicking and speechifying for the Democratic Party, and then returned to Brooklyn to work for 2 papers there. Brooklyn was Whitman's home port. In September of 1848, just 7 months after leaving with his brother Jeff to edit a newspaper in New Orleans, he returned to found and edit the Brooklyn Freeman in order to fight the spread of slavery in America's new territories. So he was anything but an isolated singer of ethereal songs. In the early 1850s, even while writing the 12 unrhymed poems that would make up the first edition of Leaves of Grass, he was freelancing in journalism, running a print shop and bookstore, and building houses, just like his father before him. So it shouldn't surprise you to learn that Whitman not only wrote the opening lines of Leaves of Grass, but also set them up in type, working right beside a pair of brothers in their Brooklyn print shop. The print shop offers us a clue to the meaning of Whitman's title, Leaves of Grass. In printer's lingo, grass means test sheets, tryout pages, glorified waste paper. And since a leaf in printer's lingo is a sheet of paper in a book, Whitman's title for his book of poems, Leaves of Grass, may be slyly self-deprecating, suggesting a bundle of throwaway sheets. But of course, Whitman also fully exploits the natural, primary meaning of the words leaves and grass. Not long before Whitman was born, John Keats, the last of the great English Romantic poets, wrote that if poetry come not as naturally as the leaves to a tree, it had better not come at all. Whitman says much the same thing in his long preface to Leaves of Grass, a preface that is really a manifesto for a new kind of American poetry. Poetry, writes Whitman, cannot be trussed up in rhyme or uniform stanzas, but must rather burst into bloom, quote, as unerringly and loosely as lilacs or roses on a bush. So even as Whitman prided himself on combining the skills of a manual laborer with the vision of a poet, the very word leaves forges a link between the workaday urban world of the print shop and the perennial rural freedom of nature. In the opening lines of his first book of poems, the lines I quoted a few minutes ago, Whitman says, "I lean and loaf at my ease, observing a spear of summer grass." Spear of grass, blade of grass. Those are the words we typically use for a single grass shoot. But for the single grass shoot, Whitman also used the term leaf, as when he writes, "I believe a leaf of grass is no less than the journey work of the stars." So far as I know, Whitman was the first writer who ever used the word leaf for a blade of grass. But doing so allowed him not only to link the leaves of nature with the printed pages of his book, but also, by implication, to link individual grass shoots with the citizens of a great democracy. To suggest that every free citizen of the United States is a unique blade of grass, and yet also part of this great green rolling land of ours, a spear in an evergreen carpet of grass, or a leaf on the undying tree of liberty. I want to say more about the pervasive image of grass in Whitman's poetry, especially in Song of Myself. But let me first pause over the phrase journey work of the stars. In the mid-19th century, as now, a journeyman was a laborer who had finished his apprenticeship and thereby proved himself a competent worker. Not a master yet, but a man capable of a good, solid day's work, which is what the word journey meant originally, as in the French word for day even now, which is journée. As a skilled laborer himself, Whitman respected a good day's work, and even more the dignity of the working man. Deep into the Song of Myself, he recalls the gods and heroes of ancient Greece and Egypt, the figures who populate epic poems, such as those of Homer, which he knew very well. But while taking all these ancient gods and heroes for what they are worth, and not a cent more, he claims equal or even greater glory for the house builder and the carpenter, quote, driving his mallet and chisel. More remarkably, in a passage that uncannily anticipates the heroism of New York firefighters in our own time, he roundly declares that, quote, lads ahold of fire engines and hook and ladder ropes are no less to me than the gods of the antique wars, unquote. Whitman unequivocally proclaims the divinity of all humankind. The soul, he writes in the preface to Leaves of Grass, the soul cannot admit that there is anything in the known universe more divine than men and women. And for Whitman, no man or woman, not even the poet himself, could be more divine than the workman. So nothing in Leaves of Grass is more distinctively Whitmanesque than to speak of the stars with all their brilliant fire and seemingly infinite glory, to speak of the stars as journey work, no greater or more divine than the product of a good day's work or the beauty of a single leaf of grass. I want to say more about the image of grass because it springs up early in Song of Myself. In section 6 of the poem, which has 52 sections in all, a child asks, "What is the grass?" Not knowing for sure, the poet makes a series of guesses. "I guess," he says first, "I guess it must be the flag of my disposition, out of hopeful green stuff woven." Now the word flag means here, of course, a banner made of cloth, not the red, white, and blue of the stars and stripes, but a woven green sign of the poet's vital hope. Yet the word flag also means a plant with a long blade-like leaf, such as the so-called sweet flag that grows around ponds. In section 24 of the poem, sweet flag is one of several natural phenomena that the poet considers holy enough to be worshipped. So Whitman's flag is bound up with grass. And in Whitman's eyes, grass, in turn, points upward to God, outward across the land and downward to the grave. After first guessing that grass might be the flag of his hope, the poet guesses that it might be, quote, the handkerchief of the Lord. Then a child produced by the soil. Then a uniform hieroglyphic, a picture writing that grows all over the country and thus signifies the union of all Americans. Finally, in the most moving metaphor of all, the poet envisions the grass as the beautiful uncut hair of graves. Aside from its breathtaking beauty, this wonderful metaphor exemplifies Whitman's transcendentalism, a long and grandiose term that we must take a moment to examine. As Whitman's most recent biographer suggests, the word transcendentalism may have originated as a negative term for a group of thinkers led by Ralph Waldo Emerson. Because Emerson and his supporters preached a gospel of visionary idealism, their detractors thought of them as philosophical high flyers, transcending reason and logic. But in a lecture of 1842, Emerson gave his own decidedly rational account of transcendentalism. He traced it to Immanuel Kant, the great German philosopher of the late 18th century, who challenged the reigning empiricism of his day, the doctrine that all knowledge comes to us through the senses. Kant argued that some vitally important ideas, such as the idea of existence or individuality, do not come to us through sensory experience, but rather spring from the mind itself as intuitions transcending all material forms. So in a word, Emerson defined transcendentalism as idealism, by which he meant a refusal to be absolutely bound by the material facts of life and a profound faith in the power of thought, will, and inspiration. But the transcendentalists did not shut their eyes or ears to the material world. On the contrary, they took every visible, audible, tangible thing as a symbol of the human mind, or rather a symbol of the relation between everything in the whole universe and the individual center of consciousness, the individual self. In the very first chapter of Melville's Moby Dick, which appeared just 4 years before Leaves of Grass, and clearly reflects the influence of transcendentalism, Ishmael takes water as a mirror of the human mind. We see ourselves, he says, in all rivers and oceans. Water is the image of the ungraspable phantom of life, and this is the key to it all. But for Whitman, as for Emerson, the key to it all is himself, the subject of Song of Myself, the longest song he sings in Leaves of Grass. Quite possibly it was this gigantic exercise in self-expression that prompted Emily Dickinson to write one of her most playfully self-deprecating poems, which, like virtually all of her work, was not published until after she died. Around 1861, just after the third edition of Whitman's Leaves appeared, she wrote, "I'm nobody. Who are you?" In this poem, which for copyright reasons I'm not allowed to quote, she ends up scornfully rejecting the idea of advertising herself to the public. Telling her name to the world, she says, would be like playing a frog and croaking all day long to a bog full of admirers. Reading this gem of a poem, I confess to being wickedly tempted to imagine Whitman as a frog, a big, bumptious, self-important bullfrog. But that would hardly be fair. For the self that Whitman aspires to sing about is not Walt Whitman, but all of humankind. Whitman thus sets his poem in the great tradition of romantic autobiography that begins with the Confessions of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, first published in 1782, nearly 75 years before Leaves of Grass. In his preamble to the Confessions, a prose autobiography, Rousseau paradoxically claims that he differs from everyone else who has ever existed, but also that the story of his life, by turns noble and contemptible, virtuous and vile, is the story of a nature that every one of us can recognize as unmistakably human. I don't know whether or not Whitman ever read Rousseau, but he knew at least some of the poetry of Wordsworth, and in 1851 he read a review of Wordsworth's Prelude, his long autobiographical poem, shortly after it was published. Though far less candid about his sins than Rousseau was, Wordsworth tells the story of how his mind and imagination grew in order to exemplify the stages of how we all develop, or supposedly can develop. In America, a contracted version of this exemplary story appeared 4 years after the publication of Wordsworth's Prelude and 1 year before Leaves of Grass. In 1854, Henry David Thoreau's Walden told the story of his 2 years living in a cabin that he built himself on the shore of Walden Pond in Concord, Massachusetts. Like Whitman, Thoreau took pride in his home-building skills, and in Walden he argues that anyone can house and feed himself by the work of his own hands. So Thoreau tells his own story of house building and farming as an example for all of us. "If I seem to boast more than is becoming," he writes, "my excuse is that I brag for humanity rather than for myself." I mention these autobiographical works of Rousseau, Wordsworth, and Thoreau as precursors for Whitman's Song of Myself. But I also want to show what distinguishes this poem from its predecessors, what makes it original and new. In spite of its title, Song of Myself is not autobiographical. It has almost nothing to say about Whitman's personal life, and what it does say can be misleading. For instance, Though Whitman was born on Long Island and raised in Brooklyn, where he spent almost all of his life, he calls himself at one point a son of Manhattan. This is true only insofar as we can accept his identification with the sons and daughters of every other city and town in the nation or the world. For that matter, Whitman thus takes a giant step beyond the tradition of romantic autobiography, where the writer presents his life in such a way as to enable each of us to find ourselves in him. For if we recognize ourselves in the self of Whitman's song, it's because he identifies that self with you, the reader, with anyone and everyone who might pick up the poem, and also with everyone else. What I assume, he writes, you shall assume, and every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. If Emerson's transcendental eye sees everything in the universe as a symbol of his own consciousness, Whitman identifies himself with every man and woman on earth. Furthermore, while Thoreau tells the story of his house building to show us all what we can do at our best, Whitman claims to identify himself with the worst as well as with the best of us. I am not the poet of goodness only, he writes, but the poet of wickedness also. He invites to his feast one and all, including the kept woman, sponger, and thief. And he doesn't just tolerate all kinds of people, he claims to become them. In the very long section 32, a poem in itself, he tells us that he is not only the bridegroom, but the widow screeching over her husband's fresh corpse. He is the captain who saved the company on a rudderless ship in a storm. He is the hounded slave bitten by dogs and beaten by whips. He is the fireman whose chest has been broken by tumbling walls and is tenderly exhumed by his mates, and so on. Even if the fireman dies, and it's not quite clear from the passage whether he does or not, but even if he dies, the poet's identification with him will not cease. For Whitman felt himself in touch with everyone who ever lived. He eagerly embraced the 19th century theory of something called animal magnetism, a kind of electricity that circulates throughout the universe and permeates all beings, the living and the dead. When Whitman reads the grass as the beautiful uncut hair of the dead, he is illustrating not only the transcendental habit of taking all material objects as symbols of our inner life, he's also celebrating his faith in the vitality of a spirit that transcends the border between life and death. So Whitman celebrates a life that perseveres after death and even manifests itself in a kind of resurrection, the new growth of grassy hair. In thus celebrating life after death, Whitman subtly invites us to link him with the primordial prophet of resurrection, namely Christ. If this seems an audacious or even blasphemous move, we do well to remember that earlier poets had made similar moves. In the opening lines of Paradise Lost, which first appeared in 1667, John Milton asks for the same kind of inspiration that enabled Moses to write the first 5 books of the Old Testament. In the early 19th century, Percy Bysshe Shelley plainly identifies himself with Christ in Ode to the West Wind, where he writes, "I fall upon the thorns of life, I bleed." In Adonais, his elegy for John Keats, Shelley appears among the mourners as a frail figure with an ensanguined brow, a forehead bloodied, we are told, like Christ's. More remarkably, Wordsworth concludes the prelude by placing himself and his fellow poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge firmly in the prophetic tradition. We, he says to Coleridge, are prophets of nature, working to deliver all mankind from servitude and shame. Whitman would never have stated his aims in terms so grandiose as these, and he was far more open about his instincts, especially his sexual instincts, than Wordsworth ever was. But insofar as Whitman assumes a personality in Leaves of Grass, it's a personality calculated to suggest Christ. Whitman's construction of this Christ-like personality begins with his frontispiece to his book, which is based on a photograph taken in 1854 during the time when Whitman was occupied with the quintessentially Christ-like trade of carpentry. As James E. Miller has noted, the head and shoulders photo of the lightly bearded man with a sympathetic gaze and an open-necked shirt catches the dreamy-eyed poet in just the right light to suggest a halo. It would not take much retouching, as Whitman must have known, to transfigure the photograph into a portrait of Christ. Whitman stopped short of doing this in the frontispiece engraved for his book. where the glow of the would-be halo is snuffed out by a wide-brimmed black hat, and the sympathetic gaze becomes a jaunty air of mild defiance in what is now a three-quarter-length portrait of a man with one hand in his pocket and the other on his hip. Whitman considered this picture absolutely essential to his book of poems. It projects a mood of careless, even insolent assurance that is confirmed by the opening lines of Song of Myself, where the singer loafs at his ease, looking at a blade of grass. How this loafer gets to signify Christ is a question I'll pursue in just a minute. But it's worth noting first that the careless, open-shirted assurance of Whitman's stance at the frontispiece is also confirmed by the form of his poetry, which spurns all regularity of rhyme and meter. Blank verse, unrhymed verse with a regular metrical beat, had been around since Shakespeare's day. And in the 18th and early 19th centuries, a few other English poets had tried writing poems without meter of any kind. But by producing an entire book of such poems, Whitman effectively became the progenitor of free verse in the English language. In Whitman's hands, free verse conveys a political charge. It expresses his radically democratic faith in the value of the common man and his disdain for any artificial barriers that might be used to separate the language of poetry from that of the ordinary reader. Hand in hand with this ambition to speak naturally goes the urge to speak like nature, to imitate the freedom of nature in his words. Many years after Leaves of Grass first appeared, Whitman told a newspaper interviewer that he thought verse written to a regular beat was like the walking of a lame man. What he sought to achieve in his own verse, he said, was the rhythm of nature manifested by the rolling of waves and the roughing of the wind in the trees. Here again, though he may not have realized it, Whitman echoes the English Romantic poets. In Ode to the West Wind, Shelley begs the tameless spirit of the wind to inspire him. And in Ode to a Skylark, he takes the unpremeditated art of the bird's song as the model for his own. But both of Shelley's songs come boxed and bound in regular meter and rhyme. Whitman's song breaks out of the box. Twisting, one might say, the tail feathers of Shelley's ethereal Skylark, Whitman ends the Song of Myself by taking his cue from the raw, abrasive cry of the spotted hawk. I too, he writes, am not a bit tamed. I too am untranslatable. I sound my barbaric yawp over the roofs of the world. Yet for all its crudity, Whitman's barbaric yawp may be traced to an ancient and sacred source. Whatever his language owes to the winds and the waves and the birds, it also evokes the richly parallel language of the Old Testament. As Bliss Perry has noted, the parallelism of Hebrew poetry gave the English of the King James Version a heightened rhythm without destroying the flexibility and freedom natural to prose. The parallelism that came to English from Hebrew poetry powerfully informs the Song of Myself, which at one point uses the parallel structure of the Old Testament to identify the singer with the hero of the New Testament. The poet is suddenly alarmed, he says, to think that he could forget his own Christ-like sufferings, that I could forget the mockers and insults, that I could forget the trickling tears and the blows of the bludgeons and hammers, that I could look with a separate look on my own crucifixion and bloody crowning. Passages like this may invite the charge of presumption or pretension, just as Shelley does when he somewhat mawkishly claims to be falling on the thorns of life. But we do well to remember that the ideal Christian life is an imitatio Christi, as medieval Christian writers called it, an imitation of the life of Christ. We must remember, too, that for Whitman, divinity is not something infinitely remote from human experience. It animates every man and woman on earth. And if we know how to look, it shows itself to our very own eyes. In Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, which appeared in 1856 with the second edition of Leaves of Grass, the poet sees the reflection of his head as a center of almost supernatural radiance. I looked, he writes, I looked at the centripetal spokes of light around the shape of my head in the sunlit water. But the singer's claim to a Christ-like identity goes well beyond moments of radiance such as these. In Leaves of Grass, above all in Songs of Myself, Whitman preaches an all-inclusive gospel of love. Like Christ, who befriended thieves and prostitutes, Whitman welcomes everyone to his feast. reaching out to all, empathizing with the longings and sufferings of all, his imagination crosses the gender divide. I am the poet of the woman, the same as the man. Also, true to the spirit of Christ incarnate, he celebrates a love that embraces every part of human nature. I am the poet of the body, he writes, and I am the poet of the soul. For all his claim to a Christ-like identity, however, Whitman's insistence on celebrating the body along with the soul offended many of his readers and may well disturb some readers even now. In section 11 of Song of Myself, a rich, beautiful, and lonesome young woman living in a fine house by the shore gazes out with unrequited desire at the young men bathing before her. And in imagination she becomes the water that slides all over their bodies. Though hardly racy enough to warrant even a PG-13 rating today, this mild eroticism prompted one critic to denounce the Leaves as a mass of stupid filth in a review that Whitman himself boldly reprinted in the second issue of the first edition, which appeared 5 months after the first issue. At this point, Whitman must have felt that he was proof against any kind of vituperation because he had already been canonized by the Pope of mid-19th century American culture, Ralph Waldo Emerson. In August of 1855, on receiving a gift copy of Whitman's new book from the poet himself, who was then wholly unknown to him, Emerson promptly wrote to say that he found the book, quote, the most extraordinary piece of wit and wisdom that America has yet contributed. I greet you, he added, at the beginning of a great career. Whitman treasured this letter like solid gold. Without Emerson's permission, he published it in the second edition of Leaves of Grass, which appeared in 1856. And in gold letters on the spine of the book, he quoted its key words. Yet not even Emerson could keep Whitman from celebrating the sexual pleasures of love ever more openly in later editions of the Leaves. In 1860, when Whitman went to Boston to oversee the printing of the third edition, Emerson urged him to expurgate a set of explicitly sexual poems called Children of Adam. No, no, said Whitman. He knew exactly what he wanted to say and was determined to say it. By 1860, he was not only writing frankly about heterosexual love, he was also writing frankly about love between men. The most conspicuously homosexual poems he ever wrote first appeared grouped under the title Calamus in the 1860 edition of Leaves. This group of 45 poems, and in particular the 12 that Whitman originally called Calamus Leaves, have often prompted readers to wonder if Whitman was homosexual himself. I can't say for certain. Though we know that Whitman never married, we have no definitive facts about his sex life. The evidence suggests only that he may well have had homosexual as well as heterosexual experiences. But for students of his poetry, what finally matters is that Whitman wrote the Calamus poems to forestall, if anyone could forestall it, the frightening imminence of civil war. In the late 1850s, the mood of the nation was fratricidally divided. North against South, abolitionists against slaveholders, Unionists against champions of states' rights. What the country desperately needed, Whitman felt, was a new gospel of love, a love that would bind man to man and thereby North to South. In section 22 of a poem first called Premonition and finally Starting from Paumanok, Whitman writes, I will sing the song of companionship. I will show what alone can compact these states. I believe the main purport of America is to found a new ideal of manly friendship, more ardent, more general. Whitman's poems of manly friendship failed, of course, to prevent the Civil War. But he did what he could to heal its wounds. In December 1862, when he learned that his brother George had been wounded in the Battle of Fredericksburg, he went to Washington to look for him. On learning that George's wound was only superficial, he stayed to help nurse other wounded men. And right after the war, he struck up a close friendship with a veteran of the Confederate Army who had been wounded at Antietam, fighting right across the line from Walt's brother George. All men ever born are my brothers, wrote Whitman, and all women my sisters and lovers. Out of this all-embracing love, he composed his elegy for Abraham Lincoln, cut down by an assassin's bullet on April 14, 1865. Together with the pain of that death, the inexorable vitality of spring led Whitman to create one of the most poignant elegies ever written. Its opening lines must be my closing words. When lilacs last in the dooryard bloomed, and the great star early drooped in the western sky in the night, I mourned, and yet shall mourn with ever returning spring.